Russia's soldiers are dying, its tanks are burning, and its economy is in free fall. Putin wanted to cripple Ukraine, but the only thing he's crippled is Russia itself. And in this video, we're going to show you every way this war has left Russia weaker than ever. We start with Russia's oil and gas business. Just before Putin started the Ukraine war, both of these sectors were among the strongest Russia had to offer. In January 2022, 1 month before the invasion, Reuters reported that sales of Russian oil and natural gas had far exceeded all projections for 2021. Those sales drove so much money into Russia that they accounted for more than a third of the country's entire budget. As always, Russia's energy industry was big business. Oil and gas revenues had exceeded projections by 51.3%. generating $119 billion for the Russian economy. At one point in October, these two industries were earning a staggering $500 million per day. Putin should have kept that gravy train rolling. Almost all of Europe relied on oil and gas from Russia. According to the European Council, the European Union or EU imported nearly $75 billion of oil alone in 2021, accounting for around 2/3 of Russia's total sales for the year. Then Putin invaded Ukraine, and so much of those oil and gas sales went away. Now, the EU has a blanket ban that covers 90% of oil imports from Russia. It's also implemented a price cap on any Russian oil it does buy, spending no more than $60 on a barrel of crude oil at a time when the standard price is $71.97 per barrel. And it's not just Russian oil that's being affected. In June 2024, the EU implemented sanctions on Russia's gas sector. Those sanctions wouldn't stop Russian gas from flowing into EU countries. Europe still relies on Russia for much of its gas. But what it will do is ban EU ports from reselling the Russian gas to other countries after it arrives, in addition to blocking financing for Russia's Baltic and Arctic natural gas terminals. In other words, major infrastructural work Russia wanted to complete won't be happening, and it'll be losing sales to countries that only bought its gas so they could resell it at a higher price to other countries. That's a major blow. And the craziest thing is that Putin himself fed into this massive economic loss. According to The Economist, Russia stopped much of its natural gas imports into Europe in 2022. It was a clever idea, in theory. Sending less has meant that the price shot up, allowing Russia to earn more despite lowering its export volumes. It hoped to make a Europe that relied on Russia to supply 40% of its natural gas so desperate that it would hold off on supporting Ukraine. That didn't happen. Instead, Russia found itself struggling to redirect the 180 billion cubic meters of gas that it would have otherwise sold to Europe elsewhere. It also lacked the plants it would need to store this gas at temperatures of -256 Fahrenheit, essentially making the gas it was producing unsellable. Fast forward 2 years and the EU is also sanctioning that gas, making it even harder for Russia to sell one of its most valuable resources. Why does all of this matter in the context of crippling Russia? Well, it's simple. There's far less money flowing into the country than there was before Putin launched his special military operation. Not only does that mean that Putin doesn't have the cash he needs to properly fund his war machine, but it also means Russia can't invest in two of its most lucrative industries. There's no money or equipment to explore new oil and gas fields, and as the world transitions further toward greener energy sources, it's likely that demand for gas ahead of oil will rise at a time when the EU is vastly reducing its purchases of gas from Russia. The country has options. The Power of Siberia pipeline that serves China is ramping up, and there's talk of a second Power of Siberia pipeline in the works. But even that won't save Russia's gas industry. According to Sergei Vakulenko, who's a former oil executive at Russian state-owned giant Gazprom, China could choose to wait until 2025 or 26, when liquid natural gas supplies open up from Qatar and the US. If it does that, Russia will be getting $257 per cubic meter of gas from China in 2027, compared to $320 per cubic meter today. Plus, Gazprom has to recoup its investment into the Power of Siberia pipelines, meaning it'll have to run them at full capacity for 20 years before it even makes its money back. It all adds up to crippled oil and gas industries for Russia. The Economist says that Russia may never be able to claw back the lucrative oil and gas industries it had in Europe after the war ends. European countries have already found alternatives and are massively cutting back on their reliance on Russia's products. Even with China buying from Russia, it'll do so at a cut rate, which means Russia will never again achieve the record revenues it saw in 2021. That's terrible news for a country that's already been so heavily drained financially by Putin's war. Russia's leader has unintentionally damaged Russia's most lucrative sector while plunging his country into economic chaos to fund his war. Russia will become a much poorer country as a result, unable to rely on what was previously its biggest pair of industries to make back the money that Putin's wasted. And it gets worse for Russia. Beyond oil and gas, selling weapons to other countries was one of Putin's biggest money spinners. That industry hit its peak in the early 2010s. Granted, it's been on a downward trend since then. Russian arms exports were 20% lower in 2019 than they were in 2011, for instance. At the 2011 peak, Russia was selling to 35 different countries, almost putting it on par with the United States when it comes to sheer number of clients. By 2022, when Putin started his war, Russia was down to selling to just 12 countries, with its exports declining by 70% compared to their 2011 numbers. It's only gotten worse from there. In March 2024, Defense News reported that Russian weapons sales had plummeted even further. It says the country saw a drop of 53% between the 2014-18 period and 2019-23. Western sanctions due to the Ukraine war played a huge role in this decline. So too did Russia's declining reputation as a country that could make quality weapons. China cut its purchases by 39%, with Egypt buying 54% fewer weapons during this period. Even Algeria and Vietnam, previously Russia's third and fourth largest customers, exported 83% and 91% fewer Russian weapons respectively in 2019-23 than they did in 2014-18. Why did this happen? Part of the reason is that Russia needs as many weapons as it can get its hands on in the Ukraine war. A nearly 3-year campaign wasn't what Putin anticipated, so many of the weapons he would have sold to other countries may now have to stay in Russia. But that doesn't account for the fact that Russia's weapons sales were declining before Putin began his special military operation. There's something else going on here, a truth that many of Russia's buyers already realized and has only been thrown under a stark spotlight during the war. Russia doesn't make good weapons anymore. If the Ukraine war has proven anything, it's that Russia's most advanced weapon systems aren't able to help it overcome a country that's meant to be far inferior in terms of military might. Even with aid flooding in from the West, Putin's propaganda focused on the superiority of Russia's weapons over those supplied by NATO. That superiority doesn't exist. The likes of China and India recognized this before the war started, which is why they're so drastically reducing their weapons purchases. Add sanctions into the mix, meaning past Russian customers won't buy from the country anymore due to its actions in Ukraine, and you get another struggling industry. Russia can't even rely on selling weapons to sub-Saharan Africa anymore. That region, which has been plagued by civil wars and strife, was a lifeline for Russia's ailing weapons industry before the war. Russia accounted for 26% of all sales to the region between 2018 and 22. That share fell to 17% between 2019 and 23, again suggesting that the Ukraine war, revealing the weaknesses of Russian weapons, has had an impact on its arms industry. Granted, this decline comes at a time when African countries are importing 52% fewer weapons overall, but even so, the market share loss alone tells us that Russia has quickly fallen out of favor with the countries that still want weapons, with China overtaking it as the leading supplier. Where does all of this leave Russia so far? The Ukraine war has crippled 3 of the country's strongest industries. It's not selling as much oil, gas, or weapons as it used to sell, and there seems to be very little prospect of a recovery once the war ends. That war was the catalyst for these declines, with sanctions being the most obvious culprit. But in the case of Russia's weapons, the war has proven that Russia simply doesn't make weapons as well as the countries that are supplying Ukraine. Russia's customers are fleeing in droves, with the money they would have spent going with them. That's all money that could have helped prop up Russia's struggling economy, and without that incoming cash, Russia is only going to damage itself even more as it drags Putin's special military operation on. The country will grow poorer and poorer, leaving it in a terrible economic state regardless of whether Russia wins or loses. Speaking of the economy, the Ukraine war also had a massive impact on the value of the Russian ruble. The effect was almost immediate, according to the Wall Street Journal. Just hours after Russian tanks rolled over the Ukrainian border, Russia's stock market lost about half of its value, and the ruble's value fell by 8%. That put it at its lowest since March 2020, when the country was gripped by the COVID-19 market panic. Fast forward to October 2024 and the picture hasn't gotten any prettier for Russia and its ruble. On October 10th, Reuters reported that the ruble had cratered again, hitting 97.40 rubles to $1 for the first time since October 2023. The currency was also down 1.29% on the Chinese yuan. The Moscow Times also reported on this collapsing currency value, claiming that Russian authorities had all but resigned themselves to seeing their country's currency decline past the 100 rubles to the US dollar mark by the end of the year. Now, a currency declining in value isn't always a bad thing for a country. Indeed, the Moscow Times claims that the low exchange rate could benefit Russia's state budget as it prepares to spend even more than the billions it's already blown on an invasion that was only meant to last a couple of days. But there are plenty of negative economic shocks that a collapsing currency brings with it. Imports become even more expensive, meaning Russia essentially has to spend more to purchase whatever it needs to keep going. The ruble offers less bang for the buck than it previously offered, which manifests in the everyday Russian getting less access to foreign foods than they'd otherwise have. Conversely, Russian exports will become even cheaper for other countries to buy. Again, that could be a good thing in a typical situation. Lower prices mean the country could export more goods, only that's not happening as Russia would have hoped. The sanctions placed on it due to the war, meaning it's not exporting anywhere near the volume it needs to export to ensure the value of the ruble doesn't decline any further. What does all of this mean for the future of Russia? Rampant inflation coupled with extremely high interest rates. Prices inside Russia have risen constantly since the war began. Statista reports that inflation hit a staggering 17.8% in April 2022, just a couple of months after the Ukraine war began. It's fallen considerably since, though nowhere near what the country would consider a healthy level. Russia's central bank aims for annual inflation of 4%. In October 2024, Russia's inflation rate stood at 8.5%, more than double the target rate. Again, the Ukraine war has played its part in all of this. Western sanctions are the chief cause of this high inflation. It amounts to the everyday Russian living in a country that's suffering under a cost of living crisis that absolutely will not go away when the war ends. Sanctions will likely continue whether Russia or Ukraine wins the war. Russia will have to rebuild in so many areas that it seems likely that the poor will only get poorer over the next few decades. And those everyday Russians don't even have the option of borrowing money to ease their financial woes. On October 25, 2024, Le Monde reported that Russia had hiked its base interest rate up to 21%. That's the highest rate it's been since 2003, when Putin was in the process of trying to revitalize the country's economy, and they're expected to go higher. Trading Economics suggests Russia's interest rate will hit 23% by the end of 2024. Russia's central bank was forced to comment, stating, "Further tightening of monetary policy is required to ensure the return of inflation to the target and reduce inflation expectations." It also suggested rates will rise higher, staying in line with Trading Economics predictions. Now, the bank didn't blame the war for these rising rates, at least not directly. It instead pointed to high government spending as the reason behind the higher rate. That high spending is a direct result of the Ukraine war. Even worse for Russia, the war has led to wages spiraling as prices increase, with the rising interest rates failing to cool inflation because Russia's economy is now heavily reliant on the government pouring money into the Ukraine offensive. The more Russia spends on fighting Ukraine, the worse inflation gets, and the higher interest rates have to go. The long and short of it is simple. Putin is well on his way to bankrupting Russia. His actions have crippled the oil and gas industries, meaning they're far less lucrative now than they were in 2021. Even worse is the fact that Russia will be forced to sell its gas to China in the future at lower prices than it's selling right now, despite inflation. The average Russian now lives in an era when the cost of goods is rocketing out of control while their wages stagnate. They can't even borrow money at a reasonable rate. Interest on those loans is only going to get higher from here. It all adds up to a bleak economic future for Russia, and it's not going to get better even if Russia wins the war in Ukraine. Why? Well, with victory comes the hefty bill of rebuilding the country that it spent nearly 3 years destroying. In February 2024, the World Economic Forum estimated that the cost of rebuilding Ukraine would be $486 billion if the war had ended right then. Obviously, it didn't. The rebuilding cost has likely gone well beyond $500 billion at this point, with over 2 million housing units, 300 bridges, and over 5,000 miles of Ukrainian roads that all need to be rebuilt. Remember that destroying Ukraine wasn't the goal for Putin. He wanted to take control of the country and make it part of Russia, as it was during the Soviet Union. So he has to rebuild if he wins, otherwise everything he's done since February 2022 would add up to nearly bankrupting his country to turn Ukraine into a crater in the ground. The obvious question is, where will that money come from? Foreign investment into Russia has fallen off a cliff. It declined by $8.7 billion during the first 3 quarters of 2023 alone, and Putin's actions have devastated every major Russian industry. War is the only thing that's keeping Russia going. As soon as it ends, whether Russia wins or loses, there's a massive rebuilding bill awaiting Russia that it can't afford to pay. Economist Renaud Foucault says, "A protracted stalemate might be the only solution for Russia to avoid total economic collapse." Ukraine isn't going to agree to any cessation of the war that involves Russia continuing to occupy the country's territory. Russia is in a bad spot. The cost of rebuilding Ukraine climbs ever higher as the country continues to drain its limited financial resources. This precarious financial situation is going to lead to a collapse. Russia will eventually have to face its own economic reality in a new world in which it has become a geopolitical pariah. And therein lies another way that the war will cause Russia's collapse. Its military is a shadow of what it used to be. We can approach this point from both the ideological and practical angles. For the former, Russia has revealed itself to be incapable of defeating a smaller country that its military should have overrun. Even with aid from the West, Putin's reversion to World War I-era trench warfare shows that Russia's weapons spending amounts to little. It's stuck in a version of warfare that the world's other major powers moved beyond decades ago. This isn't to say that Russia is no longer considered a threat. It has nuclear weapons after all, but the fear factor its conventional military created for so many years has evaporated, meaning Russia no longer has the level of influence it used to have on the geopolitical stage. This is a country that has always relied on projecting power to influence the rest of the world. Those projections aren't what they used to be, as Russia has revealed itself to be a paper tiger. On a practical level, Putin's war has completely depleted Russia's military. It's cost Russia 720,000 people who have died or suffered injury while fighting against Ukraine, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, or Minfin. Over 20,000 artillery systems are gone, with a similar number of armored vehicle losses. Russia has lost over 9,300 tanks, according to Minfin, along with 999 anti-aircraft systems. As one Western official put it in February 2024, Russia's domestic ammunition production capabilities are currently insufficient for meeting the needs of the conflict. It's not just ammo that's a problem on this front. Artillery and tanks are also running out, with Semaphore pointing out that Russia simply doesn't have the means to replenish them. Quoting The Economist, it says, "The Soviet armaments supply chain no longer exists," noting that Russia can't get the materials it needs for weapons as it did back in the 1980s. Sanctions aren't going to make that any easier, and the West is likely to retain its sanctions regardless of how the war turns out. So where does that leave Russia's military for the future? It's massively depleted, to the point where Putin is struggling to field the weapons he needs in Ukraine. That's why he's been forced to call on other nations, including North Korea and China, to keep his military stocked up. They provide the weapons, and the people in North Korea's case, that Russia is struggling to get itself. When the war finally ends, Russia's power plays will mean far less than they ever have, because its conventional military won't be anywhere near as powerful as it should be. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have died. Tens of thousands of units of equipment have been sacrificed to the special military operation. Rebuilding all of that will be a decades-long process at the best of times. But when you throw Russia's economic woes into the mix, the odds are that it's not going to have the money it needs to replenish its military anytime soon. Russia's military and its reputation have been indelibly tarnished by the Ukraine war. That's according to RAND, which says, "Perception of the quality of its military and effectiveness of its arsenal has been damaged." It calls the country's land fighting strategies and equipment questionable, which the falling weapon export figures mentioned earlier support. It also points to endemic corruption as lying at the heart of all these shortcomings. Whatever the reason, Russia's military, supposedly at the height of its powers, was proven to offer inadequate planning and training during the Ukraine war. That's why Putin fell back on his meat grinder approach. He had no other tactics, because Russia simply isn't as well-oiled a war machine as it would have the rest of the world believe. That lack of military strength will prove telling for Russia in the future. NATO is more prepared to handle a Russian assault than it's been in a long time. In 2024 alone, 23 of NATO's 32 members will either reach or exceed the organization's target of spending 2% of gross domestic product on defense. That compares favorably to a paltry 7 that hit the target in 2022. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has only succeeded in making NATO stronger, the exact opposite of what Putin wanted to achieve from a power play perspective. Worse yet for Russia, NATO is getting stronger at a time when Russia's military is weakened and its economy is on the verge of collapse. Putin has put his country in the pockets of other nations, North Korea and China, just to keep his military running. When the Ukraine war ends, those countries will be leaning on Russia to repay its debts, as Russia faces up to a Europe that's far more prepared for it, regardless of how the war turns out. And all of this is set against a backdrop of Russia losing people. Lots of people. Over 700,000 in the war so far. Between 370,000 and 700,000 Russians fled the country to avoid military conscription or because they didn't agree with Putin's special military operation. As Rand points out, many of these people are among Russia's best and brightest, meaning Putin has condemned his country to a future in which his country will lack innovation as well as labor. Some projections estimate that Russia's population will be just 125 million by 2050, a loss of around 21 million from current figures. It all adds up to a bleak future for Russia. The country's economy is in the toilet, with any prospect of the Ukraine war ending threatening to destroy it completely because it's now almost solely war-focused. Russia's oil and gas sector will never recover to hit the peaks it enjoyed before the war, and its shambolic military display in Ukraine is going to do no favors for its weapons exporting business. The country's stock market is shaky. The ruble has collapsed amidst high inflation and exorbitant interest rates. Russia's military is running dry in both equipment and people, with the latter issue forcing labor shortages and demographic changes for decades to come. Russia as we know it is crippled, regardless of whether it wins or loses in Ukraine. But what do you think about what the future holds for Russia? Will the country somehow manage to recover from its losses, both to its geopolitical image and its more tangible losses? Or are we witnessing the final collapse of a former superpower, all thanks to a tiny country that Putin believed he'd overrun in a matter of days? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Forget Ukraine, Russia's biggest problem exposed, or click this other video instead.